Greetings everyone, this is Ohio Dan. The topic for today's video is the idea of Balkanizing the US. And what I mean by that is the process of fragmenting the country into smaller regional units that basically would be along ideological lines. And this comes from what Stardusk and others within the greater manosphere have talked about occasionally, although this is really more of a political topic. I know some of my audience is interested in political discussion, some of my audience isn't, and that's fine. But I wanted to basically argue against the idea that balkanizing the US, separating it into autonomous regions based on what seems to be the prevalent ideology in those regions, that would be a solution, or at least a first step toward solving the great polarization of ideology in politics, right? Where you have so many people that are very leftist, very much into what you could call woke ideology, versus conservative people that love Trump. You could separate the country out and solve our ideological and political problems to some degree by just allowing the country to basically fragment or splinter in a way that is supposedly natural along those lines. And it's not that I have some great love for the idea that the United States has to remain whole and we need to preserve the Union. That has nothing to do with the issue here as far as I'm concerned. The big problem with applying this principle of balkanizing the U.S. is that it doesn't address the core issue of our cultural divide. And the perception, especially abroad, right? I think this is more of an international point of view. Maybe there are a lot of people in the U.S. itself that think this way as well, but I talked about this briefly with SBG, Active Aussie, MGTOW, and I know it's Stardust that has basically said, at least he's one of the content creators that has basically said that balkanizing the U.S. is just an inevitability, that's what's going to happen because you have this great disparity of ideology depending on what region of the country that you live in. It definitely seems to be an international take sometimes, but the problem is that it's not your region that is the deciding factor in determining whether you live in a red or blue area of the country. Instead, this is determined almost totally, I would say 80 to 90% of the time, this is determined by whether the urban or rural areas of your state dominate the outcome of an election. Basically, every state within the U.S. has large urban areas that vote blue, that vote left, and rural areas with towns of smaller sizes, medium-sized towns, fairly large towns, small towns, and then the countryside. People that live in those areas vote conservative. They vote red. And just very briefly, the whole red-blue thing, for anybody that doesn't understand where that's coming from, that's just something that's arbitrarily been made up to show election results in the U.S. Blue means the Democratic Party, which stands for the leftist part of the political platform. Right is the Republican Party, that stands for the conservative party, supposedly, in the U.S. You could talk about how much they're just controlled opposition or not to a large degree. You could talk about the divisions within each party. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, is far more united. The Republican Party has a lot more of differing factions that really don't like one another. But that's neither here nor there when it comes to talking about balkanization. The point, though, is that the difference is whether you live in a state that is primarily urban or primarily more rural. That is the determining factor, not the region that you happen to live in. And I'm going to show examples toward the end of this video to display pretty distinctly, pretty clearly, why it is that I think this way. Like the evidence, when you actually look at each state within the U.S., shows why just balkanizing the country would not work really. Conventional balkanization wouldn't be able to address the issue of rural versus urban by just breaking the country up into smaller regions, because this divide would simply continue in each state and each region. It's just that you would have the sort of conflict between ideology more at a local level or a regional level, but the conflict would be the same. It would just be you live in this particular state and the urban areas have more population in total than the rural areas do. So now it's left-leaning, and it's the people in the countryside that are now basically without political representation so much. Or if you live in a state that's the other way around, where you live in the only major town within that state and everybody else votes red, and so now your region is just conservative. Now your region is with some form of right-wing policies. And again, just breaking the country up would not deal with that in any way whatsoever. It would just make it more of a regional ideological battle instead of the nationwide ideological battle that we see today. The only way that you could apply Balkanization to the U.S. would be in some sort of de facto city-state arrangement. If you wanted to salvage this concept and talk about how it could work for the U.S., that's the only thing that I think would make any sense. You would basically have metropolitan areas that have embraced some sort of Marxism, frankly, that have gone completely to the left, along with people in the countryside where you might have almost complete anarchy or very small scale authority figures that really don't have nearly as much power as they do in the metropolitan areas. If the federal government structure in the U.S. basically collapsed, large cities could potentially extend their power and influence into dominating their immediate areas, while the countryside could be more of an anarchic, or like I said, a smaller scale control type of environment that either resists the larger cities or cooperates with them to some extent and forms some sort of tenuous arrangement with those nearby cities. But ultimately, this is not the mutual parting of ways that is usually suggested by those applying the concept of Balkanizing the U.S. into smaller regions. That's really nothing closely resembling, from what I can tell, the idea that, well, the southeast of the United States just needs to break off and form more of a right-leaning country, and the New England states can be a left-leaning country. And Texas and all the states in the central U.S. and part of the Midwest, they can be a conservative area, and then the West Coast can just drop off and form their own communist utopia, right? Or left-leaning, even if it doesn't go that far. From their point of view, that might be what they want to do. It's just a matter of, yes, you would have a certain ideology that would win out, but the rural versus urban divide would just continue. The people in Northern California, in other words, would be screwed. The people that live in New York State, outside of New York City, in that immediate area around New York City, or Buffalo, or Rochester, those people that are outvoted every time by the people that live in the metropolitan areas, they would be screwed because they would be living in a region that continues to not represent their interests if they live in the smaller towns around New York. Let me get into the specific examples because I really want to show you how clear this is, that just separating the U.S. into regions would really not do anything to end the polarization based on the politics and the ideology in each state. That it would just continue to exist within each region, basically, despite the idea that one region tends to be one way politically and another region tends to be another. It really is this urban versus rural divide. So let me show you some clear-cut examples of this now. Okay, guys. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole idea of was the election fixed in 2020 or anything like that. People can have their own opinions. It doesn't matter to the overall point that I'm making here, because you can look back at any election you want, especially any presidential election, and the results are going to be similar in recent history at least. I'm just starting off with Ohio to give you an example of the 2020 election and how this backs up what I've been saying about the urban versus the rural divide, right? So let's look at Ohio. Ohio went to Trump pretty easily in 2020. This is Politico's website. They have a pretty convenient way of looking at each state and each county in terms of the election results. So I'm going to use this particular resource. But Trump won Ohio pretty easily by almost 8 percentage points, or basically 8 percentage points. But let's look at each county where there's a major town. Let's look at Franklin County, Columbus. Biden had almost 65%. Cincinnati was a little bit closer than that, but Biden still won easily. Cleveland, 66.5%. Now you have some areas where there's not as much population. This happens to be Athens County, and that's where the University of Ohio is. Not Ohio State, but another large university. And so it went to Biden because of basically indoctrination of college students, right? Like they're going to vote left. Or maybe you could say that they tended to be that way to begin with. Whatever the case may be. It's clear that only the cities really voted for Biden. Toledo, Akron. Some of them are a little bit closer than others. Montgomery County, Dayton is actually pretty competitive, but Dayton is not as big as many of the other cities in Ohio either. But the end result is that the small towns and the rest of the population of Ohio here, they have far more influence over the result than Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati together. And some of the other towns as well that are fairly good size, but Trump still managed to win. Well, does that mean that Ohio is just a red state now because Trump won by 8 percentage points? Well, not if you live in Columbus. I mean, it is statewide, but not in your particular area if you live in Columbus, Cleveland, or Cincinnati, or where the university is. Let's look at a different state. Let's look at Illinois. Illinois goes blue in every election. Biden won by almost 17 percentage points. Well, that must mean that that region in the upper Midwest is left-leaning, right? Well, guess what? You look at the map of Illinois, it's almost entirely red, except for Chicagoland and some other towns. Again, I think you have Champaign and Urbana, where the university is here in north central Illinois, and you have St. Clair County, which is going to be basically a suburb of St. Louis that's in Illinois, and then most of the rest of the state, even the capital, Springfield, Sangamon County, went for Trump. But because there's so much population in the Chicago area, it doesn't make a bit of difference in terms of what the rest of the state votes like, because it's going to go blue in every state, in every election, because of the size of Chicago. Let's look at South Carolina. South Carolina, red state. Trump won by almost 12 percentage points. Hasn't voted for a Democrat in the presidential election probably since Jimmy Carter. I'm not completely sure on that, but a long time. But let's look at South Carolina. Look, Columbia votes blue. 68% to Biden. The counties surrounding Columbia are all going to Biden. Charleston, fairly close, comparatively speaking, but still clearly a blue county. I'm not sure exactly why some of these counties in the Southwest are blue. Maybe someone from that area could explain. There are other variables at play, right? I'm not trying to say that it's 100% based on urban versus rural, but you can take any state like this, the Southeast, other than Georgia in this last election, is solid red, right? Well, not if you live in Charleston or Columbia, not if you live in a particular urbanized area or any urbanized area of any size. It's going to go for the Democrat. But yet, when you look at just sort of the surface level of analysis, it seems like South Carolina is a solid red state, and it is at a statewide level, but not when it comes to every area in the state. Let's look at New York. New York, blue in every election. Biden won by over 23% in the last election. Look at what the middle of the state actually entails, what it actually shows us data-wise outside of New York, which is 67.6%, Westchester County, all these counties down here toward Albany, Syracuse, which pretty solidly Biden. Buffalo, pretty solidly Biden. Rochester, pretty solidly Biden. The entire rest of the state, pretty much, with a smattering of blue here and there, is Trump supporting. But it doesn't matter, because most of New York City, that area, is soundly voting left. Queens County, over 500,000 Biden voters, right? It's just clear that it really doesn't matter very much. You don't really even have to be that familiar with a particular state's cities and whatnot, what their geography is, to see what's going on here. It doesn't matter whether you live in a particular region or not. What matters is, do you live in New York, or do you live somewhere in the rest of the state that's not Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, or Rochester? That's what determines whether the area leans heavily to the left or to the right politically. Now, there are some states that are exceptions to this, and I'm going to show this at the end just so that people can see that there are some counterexamples. But my favorite example is actually Kentucky. Now, why is that? Well, Kentucky greatly favors Trump. Greatly favors voting for a Republican candidate. Now, they do have a Democratic governor, and they do sometimes go blue at the statewide level. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I would surmise that it's probably due to voter turnout in the rest of the state outside of Louisville, which voted 59.1% Biden, and Lexington, which voted 59.3% Biden. Or looking at the counties, Jefferson County and Fayette County. You also have, even though the entire rest of the state is red, if you look here, Franklin County, that's where the capital of Frankfurt is, but Frankfurt is not very big. And so the reason why that county is very competitive, that Trump barely took that county, 49.5% to 48.5%, is basically because you have your government employees there, right? You have a lot of government that's involved in the town or the city where your capital is, even if it's a small town. But because Frankfurt's not of any size, it's a very close call in terms of whether you have people voting left or right. But everywhere else in the state votes red, and that everywhere else totally overwhelms Louisville and Lexington, the only really two sizable towns in Kentucky, outside of maybe the suburbs of Cincinnati here, which also went to Trump. But for the most part, it's urban versus rural. Louisville is over 20% more toward Biden compared to Trump. That's not something that would be different than a town or a city in California or Texas. It just is a matter of the urbanized areas don't have the population to overwhelm the rest of the state, and so the rest of the state votes red, and the state goes to Trump in this last election. You can look at so many different other states. You can look at Texas. Again, the idea would be Texas is super conservative, right? Texas is all about right-wing policies. Well, not really. Not only did Trump only win by about 5.6%, but look at the blue areas. Austin. People will talk about Austin going blue. I think that's Travis County. 71.7% to Biden in the middle of a state that is supposedly ultra-conservative from the kind of layman's perspective, right? And I'm not trying to be insulting here. It's just, it looks like Texas is conservative. This particular result makes it look like it's closer than it has been, and it is. As more people move into Austin, as more leftists move into Texas, it is becoming closer to a toss-up state. But the idea is Texas overall is really right-leaning. Well, not so much. Houston, definitely 13% to Biden compared to the number of votes that Trump got. You can look at El Paso, 66.8% to Biden, right? You can look at southern Texas here. I don't know whether that's because of the influx of immigrants from Mexico or what the case is. That would be my guess. But Texas is not just a red state. It depends on where you live. And again, it's the urban areas versus the rural areas and the small towns to a large extent. I'm just going to give a couple of examples here in addition to what I've already shown. Michigan. Mostly, it's Detroit, Wayne County, 68.5% for Biden, along with Lansing, because that's where Michigan State University is, and a few other areas that are closer, that are more Biden-leaning, but the rest of the state basically goes red. But because of the population of Detroit, in most cases, more often than not, Michigan is a left-leaning, Democrat-leaning state. But it's not because the people that live in Michigan in the countryside are considerably different than the people that live in Ohio or Texas or even California, for that matter. California, hugely a left-leaning state, and there are many counties that are blue, but Northern California, 71.7% Trump, 56.7% Trump, 65.4%, 74.8% Trump in Northern California. But that doesn't mean anything compared to the population of LA, 71% for Biden in LA County, San Francisco, 85.3% for Biden, right? That is the cause of the issue. It's not really just the region that you're in, it's whether the cities dominate. And why are the coastal states outside of the Southeast primarily Democrat-leaning states? Because a lot of the big cities on the coast overwhelm the population in terms of who votes for whom with the rest of the state. So they look like they're just blue states, but they really aren't. It's still the urban versus rural divide. You could look at a state, again, like Oregon. Most of Oregon is red. But since the population centers are dominant, like Portland, even though Portland's not that great big, they are so overwhelmingly left voting, Democrat voting, that the rest of the state that votes 78%, 69%, 74% for Trump, they get overwhelmed in terms of who actually wins at the state level in an election. Just dividing the country up is not going to help these people. And you could even say the same thing the other way around with, for example, the Atlanta area in Georgia. If you split off the southeastern part of the country, what are the people that are voting freaking 72%, 83% for Biden going to do? They're not going to appreciate that very much. It, again, is the Atlanta metro area and a few other smatterings, Augusta, Georgia, to some extent, Macon, Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, and those towns, Savannah, versus everybody else. Well, that's not a matter of, well, Georgia is just more left-leaning than the states surrounding it. It's a matter of Atlanta being a large town and potentially outvoting everybody else. Now, you could say that the election was rigged in Georgia. It doesn't matter to me, right? The point is, the only thing that makes it close is the Atlanta metro area. It's not that the people that live in Atlanta are so much different than the people that live in Columbia, South Carolina. It's just that Columbia doesn't have enough population to deal with all the people in South Carolina that live in small towns that vote red. And the whole point, again, without getting into this too much, I did want to show you one exception to this. If you go to a place like Vermont, where for the most part, even though you don't have a major metropolitan center, Vermont is very much a leftist type of place. It is a left-leaning state. That might be more to do with culture. It might be more to do with the people that live there just being different. But that is really the exception. Vermont, New Hampshire, the New England states maybe. But for the most part, it is urban versus rural not one region versus another region. If you are a person that lives in Austin, Texas, you're not that much different than a person that lives in LA or New York City or Chicago. If you're a person that lives in rural Illinois, you're not so much different than a person that lives in rural Ohio or rural Michigan or New York or Texas. You may have many cultural differences, but your political differences are probably pretty small. The difference is between urban metropolitan centers versus every other place in the country, basically. That's the difference. And just separating the country out into its regions would really not do anything to resolve those differences. That's the point, right? Kentucky is hilarious to look at because it so much exemplifies that point. It's Lexington and Louisville versus literally everywhere else. The people in Louisville vote pretty extremely to the Democratic Party. And the same is true with Lexington, where the University of Kentucky is. But it doesn't matter because the rest of the state outvotes everybody else. Right? And so it's generally a right-leaning area, although, again, they have a Democratic governor. I would imagine that's because, to a large extent, of those two cities basically having a large voter turnout and a lot of the rest of Kentucky not having much of a voter turnout in those elections. I can almost guarantee that that's one reason why a Democrat could get elected governor in Kentucky. When you have more of a voter turnout in the small towns, there's no chance that that's going to happen, in my opinion. Just one last example, Pennsylvania. Definitely a swing state. All the areas around Philadelphia vote for Biden. Pittsburgh votes for Biden. Harrisburg votes for Biden. Most of the rest of the state pretty much votes red. The rural areas of Pennsylvania, despite Biden winning, 78% for Trump, 74%. Here's one that's 80% for Trump. And doesn't matter because Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and the other areas managed to get their say instead. It's pretty close in terms of population, so that Pennsylvania is a swing state. But that's basically what determines what a swing state is. Do the metropolitan areas and the more smaller rural areas, smaller population-wise, not in terms of geographical area, are those areas pretty close in terms of aggregate population? And if they are, you live in a swing state. With few exceptions, this is the determining factor, guys, not whether you live in a particular region or not. It wouldn't solve anything to break off the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic because the people that still live in the middle of Pennsylvania or the middle of New York, they would still essentially be without any sort of real representation, right? They would essentially continue the culture war. It's just that they would be outnumbered in their own regions, just like certain areas that don't get their say in the national level elections. It really wouldn't solve anything because the difference is not primarily the region of the country that you live in. The difference is whether you live in New York City, where in Queens County it's 72% Biden, or whether you live in the middle of New York, where it's 68% Trump. That's the difference. It's not about your region. It's about the urban versus rural divide, and just separating the country out by balkanizing it wouldn't do anything to resolve this situation, really.